Maybe some of you have had this experience where someone will ask you how you're doing these days, and you're just not quite sure how to even answer. I've literally answered people, I'm doing fine, I think. As far as I know. And that's just it. At times we think we're doing okay, as far as we know. But it's probably true that we're not even fully aware of how all that is going on with the pandemic and other things swirling around us, how it's all affecting us. Still, there may be others of you who are quite aware that you are not doing well. I can tell you personally that there have been some valleys in these last 5 months, some stretches of just kind of being in a funk. And that's probably the case for many of you as well. These are complicated and tiresome times. And with that in mind, I thought it would be a good idea to press pause on the teaching series we've been in, Church in the Spirit, going through the book of Acts. I do think that Acts is a wonderful book to study, and I want us to get back to it very soon. But right now, for a few weeks, I'd just like for us to hone in on some pure and simple gospel. In fact, that's what I'm going to call this mini-series, Pure and Simple. Remember that Acts is divided into 3 parts. The Jerusalem section, then there's the Judea and Samaria section, and then finally to the ends of the earth. And we just finished the Jerusalem section, chapters 1 through 5. So this is a very natural spot for us to sort of come up for a breath, so to speak, and to spend a few weeks doing something a little different. So we're just going to hear some pure and simple gospel, good news, some words of encouragement from Scripture that will serve as a reminder of the reason we have hope in a complicated, wearisome season of life, or for any time of life for that matter. When the world is changing and there is so much to think about and our hearts are heavy with loss or loneliness or financial challenges, political division, or whatever else is on our minds, it is so important to pause and remember God's faithfulness and just remember the pure and simple gospel. God sent His Son to the world to save it. Ever since the fall, God has been on a mission to make all things new. And throughout history, there have always been seasons where the earth is shaken and things seem to be disorienting and falling apart. But God has been faithful to His redeeming plan through it all. And no matter how things look from our vantage point, we can be assured that God has not abandoned the plan. At one point in his ministry, the Apostle Paul was being challenged by some people in Corinth. They claimed that Paul couldn't possibly be a messenger from God for a couple of reasons at least. One, because he and the others who ministered with him just weren't all that impressive. And 2, because he and the others who ministered with him were always running into so much trouble. They were always facing opposition. They were being beaten. They were imprisoned. They were shipwrecked, etc. So Paul took the time to write to the church in Corinth. This was when he wrote the second epistle to the Corinthians. And in chapter 4, verses 5 through 10, he wrote the following. For what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made His light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. One of the reasons Paul wrote this letter to the church in Corinth was because after having established the church there, he then continued on his missionary journeys, but he planned to return to Corinth as soon as he could, immediately after following a trip to the province of Asia. However, his team ran into some intense trouble, and he wasn't able to get back to Corinth like he said he would. And that's when a group of people began to question his legitimacy as an apostle, saying he can't be from God, he's just too plain and too unimpressive, and he faces too much opposition. Well, the historical indications are that Paul was indeed a pretty ordinary guy. And it's clear that he did face a lot of opposition. At the beginning of 2 Corinthians, Paul described his time in the province of Asia, and he wrote, "We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received a death sentence." Isn't it interesting to compare this list of troubles they faced with our passage today in chapter 4? Where he says, "We're hard pressed on every side but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair, persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed." He says we felt like this: pressure beyond our ability to endure, despair of life itself, like we'd received a death sentence. Then, with the benefit of hindsight, he later says, but in reality, we were not crushed, not in despair, not abandoned, not destroyed. I don't know about you, but I tend to think of Paul as sort of a Christian version of a spiritual superhero. We read about what he did in Acts and we read his epistles today, and from this side of history, we hold him like way up here. But in his own time, everywhere Paul went, people questioned his message, questioned his authority, and questioned even his leadership. In his letters, he often writes not only of his own plainness, but even of his own weakness. Even though he carries with him the message of the gospel, he knows that he himself is rather unimpressive. In this passage, he says, "We have this treasure in jars of clay." Have you ever given an expensive present to a toddler only to have the kid end up playing with the box it came in more than the toy itself? Well, that's the sort of thing that's at stake here. Paul is saying that the last thing he would ever want is for the messenger to be mistaken for the message. What he brings them is a treasure, the treasure of the gospel. And he's just the plain and simple package the treasure came in. This way, no one would be distracted by him, not by his eloquence nor his charisma. And not only was he plain and simple, he readily confesses his weakness even, and how pressed and perplexed and persecuted and struck down he was. And in telling us all this stuff, we are invited to recognize a very important truth: that it's not a bad thing to be a clay pot. There are two things about clay pots: they're fragile and they're commonplace. If you drop a clay pot, it's going to break. They are brittle and known for breaking with ease. But they were inexpensive, so even the poorest households had them. And no one would come visit and say, "Wow, what a cool clay pot." They didn't bedazzle them with jewels or anything of the sort. Just basic, old, brittle clay. But Paul is declaring here that that is a good thing. So if you're not feeling like a superhero today, if you're not at the top of your game, or if you feel like there's nothing great or special or about you, or that in this season of life, like things are just kind of blah, Well, can we just recognize today that it is okay to be a clay pot? It's okay to be fragile and weak and weary. Paul was. And if he felt that way, it's okay for us to feel that way too. There is no Jesus magic that makes us exempt from the COVID blues or any other challenges that come along with life. What Jesus' salvation does assure us of is what Paul declares in verse 17, an eternal glory that far outweighs the troubles. But even Jesus let us know that in this life you will face troubles and reminds us to fear not, for he has overcome the world. But brothers and sisters, we are susceptible to natural hills and valleys of life. So if you don't feel like a superhero these days, or ever for that matter, be encouraged. You're normal. You're a regular clay pot human being, and there is nothing wrong with that. What Paul includes with that message is that it's precisely through that fact that the gospel is displayed more clearly, more beautifully. It's a little bit funny. Paul then misquotes Genesis 1:3, the good old "let there be light" phrase. He does it on purpose because the way he says it highlights his point better. So in verse 6, Paul says, God said, "Let light shine out of darkness." He says it this way because he wants to highlight the idea that God's way, like at the beginning of creation, God's way is for light to spring forth from in the midst of darkness. That the darker the night, the brighter the light can shine. This past week was the last week before our kids start school tomorrow. Laura started a new job with the school district, so her school year actually started already last week. But the kids had one more week to kill, so in order to be out of her hair and let her prepare for the coming school year, I decided to take the kids and get one more adventure away before the year started. So I took them on a short camping trip. Well, while we were away, we learned that there was a meteor shower going on. So I kept them up late one night to watch. And we saw lots of really cool shooting stars. It was great. But we also heard that the most activity of the shooting stars would be between the hours of 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. So being the cool, adventurous father I am, I decided to wake them up at 3 a.m. so we could get an even better view of the shooting stars. But wouldn't you know it, the moon had come up. It was a bright and vivid moon, which was lovely in its own right, but it drowned out the light of many of the shooting stars. And it just reiterated the fact that the darker the night, the brighter the light can shine. So what Paul intends to communicate with this idea is that if God were to make the lives of the messengers of the gospel all shiny and bright like superstars, people would just see top-notch, snazzy people. And it would diminish the visibility or the potency of the good news itself. The good news at work in them. You see, it's in our hardship, in our hurt, in our darkness that God's love and light and the saving power of Jesus can shine the brightest. See, we often get that in reverse. We often think that we will have a stronger testimony for Jesus if our lives are all put together just right. But that's just not it. When our lives fall apart into a crumbly mess and people can see that even in that situation we still have hope and joy in the midst of the trials, that's when our light shines the brightest. In the same way that Jesus' resurrection can only be real if his crucifixion is real first, his life can only be revealed in us if his death is also revealed in us. Listen again to Paul's words. we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. As New Testament scholar N.T. Wright says, if you want to see the resurrection at work here and now in your life, you have to be prepared to see the crucifixion at work as well. Friends, we are fragile, in many ways cracked pots. And in this season, we have recognized how fragile all humanity is, which has highlighted how great the darkness is. Most of us, if not all of us, have felt emotional, physical, relational, financial, and even spiritual impacts from this season on our lives. The crucifixion is at work. We are hard pressed, and this is natural, even necessary. But when we can fix our eyes on Jesus, especially in the dark seasons like this, the light can shine brighter, and we can more clearly see and reflect Christ's resurrection at work in us. And you know what? Not only will we recognize it in ourselves, others will see it as well. And the greatest testimony we could ever have will be displayed through our weakness. Be encouraged, brothers and sisters, as these hard things, and probably some more to come, continue to unfold. The crucifixion is at work, but in Christ we will see resurrection life at work as well. And these clay pots will display most clearly the shining treasure of the gospel.
On a Sunday evening, I'm looking back over all the years and where I've been, looking at the photographs. I'm remembering you were right there, and you have been ever since. With every page that turns, I see your faithfulness. Ooh, the mountain where I climbed, the valley where I fell, you were there all along. That's the story I'll tell. You brought the pieces together, made me the storyteller. Now I know it is well, it is well. That's the story I'll tell. There were some nights that felt like they would last forever, but you kept me breathing. You were with me right then, and all that you have done for me, I can never hold it in. So here's to me telling this story over and over again. The mountain where I climbed, the valley where I fell, you were there all along. That's the story I'll tell. You brought the pieces together, made me the storyteller. Now I know it is well, it is well. That's the story I'll tell. That's the story I'll tell. Yeah, yeah. You hold the broken, you heal my every cry, every cry. My eyes are open, I know that it is well. It is well. Oh, you hold the broken, you heal my every cry, every cry. And my eyes are
May God's light shine in our darkness. May he shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. May we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in us.